ban landmines. His remarks and a question session are about 35 minutes.
Our speaker today not only personifies that Kennedy tradition, he also personifies the Smith family tradition. Quiet competence. Let me briefly tell you about our guest. Dr. William Kennedy Smith is a physiatrist. That is, a physician specializing in rehabilitation medicine and prosthetics and the care of amputees. And if you take 5 seconds and visualize caring for a room full of amputees, you will know that that is heavy duty, noble and selfless. Dr. Smith completed medical school at Georgetown University and did his residency at Northwestern University and the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago. He is, in fact, still a resident here, working at the Rehab Institute of Chicago. He has worked in Somalia, Bosnia, South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, San Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and of course, here at the Rehab Institute. His work here and overseas led him to take an active role in support of the international drive to ban the use of landmines. As part of that involvement, Dr. Smith organized Physicians Against Landmines, where he serves as president. Doctor, I know your father would be very proud of you. I think your work adds a new luster as well as a new dimension to the names of Smith and Kennedy. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome to the City Club of Chicago, Dr. William Kennedy Smith.
Gosh, that's such a nice introduction. Jay's been such a great friend to our family, and it's not easy to sit through your own eulogy. But thank you very much, Jay. As Jay mentioned, I'd first of all like to thank the City Club and Jay in particular for inviting me to speak here today. As Jay mentioned, I'm the president of Physicians Against Landmines. Our organization is an affiliate of the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago and Northwestern University. And our mission is to help end the death, dismemberment, and disability which has been caused by anti-personnel landmines. I'm sure that many of you here have heard a lot about this issue over the last months. You may have heard of Princess Diana's involvement. You may have heard of the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded to Jody Williams and the international campaign to ban landmines, of which our organization is a member. And you may have heard about the Ottawa process, which resulted in a treaty that was signed by 123 countries in Ottawa, Canada, just last week. I just got back from Ottawa at the conference, and it was an extraordinary event. I should point out that there were some important people, countries that were missing from the table in Ottawa, particularly the United States, Russia, China, India, and Pakistan. And that's more than 70% of the world's population. So the job is by no means completed. And it's sometimes frustrating, particularly when you're working with internationally, when your aim is so high, to see sometimes that your means don't achieve it. And I was talking about this with my mother, who many of you may know is ambassador to Ireland. And she has struggled with the Irish peace process now for a number of years. And she told me a story that the Irish like to tell about when your aims don't achieve your means. I'll just share it with you very briefly. The story is actually about Robin Hood's last day, and he was on his deathbed. And he called to Maid Marian, who was at his side, and said, Maid Marian, throw open a sash, throw open the window, this is it. I'm finished. And bring me my bow and bring me my arrow, and I shall fire them across the fields, which I have known so well. And where the arrow lands, there you shall bury me. So they buried him above the closet. And sometimes that's the way you feel when you start out on a mission. But I think it's been very rewarding for all of us to see the extraordinary progress that we've made. I want to talk with you first off a little bit about the logic of landmines, because as Jay mentioned, I'm a physician who treats rehabilitation, who provides rehabilitation for people who have disabilities. And landmines are designed to create permanent disability and to destroy function. And that's something that's a little bit strange for me, but I'll explain it to you as it's been explained to me. In battle, if you kill someone, you have disabled that person. You've taken them out of the picture. If you maim them, you have not only taken that person out of the picture, you've also tied up 4 or 5 people who are required to care for that person. And those who are around him will see the blood, hear the screams, be terrorized, and be less effective in their ability to get the job done. That's the logic of landmines, and that's the logic of the battlefield. I think it's important to note that the military very strongly disagree about the tactical effectiveness of this weapon. And it would not be possible for what happened in Ottawa last week and what has been going on with this ban to have occurred so quickly if the military weren't very seriously divided on this issue and didn't have serious reservations about this weapon. For those of you who may have a military background who are interested in military arguments, I just point out 3 documents which I think were important in this regard. The first was an ICRC document, International Committee for the Red Cross, called Landmines, Friend or Foe, which was published in 1996, put together with military experts, endorsed by many more. The second was a letter which was delivered to President Clinton, which was signed by 15 of this nation's top general staff, retired, including General Norman Schwarzkopf, including former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, David Jones, including the former commander in Korea. And that letter, which I hope has been brought up here and it hasn't, basically there's a paragraph there which states that given the wide range of weaponry available today, landmines are not indispensable to the United States. And the elimination of this weapon would not cause undue danger to our military forces. So I think those have been very important contributions that have been made by the military to this effort. The third document was a document published by the Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation, analyzing the use of landmines in Vietnam and the effect on our own forces. So those of you who are interested may take some interest in those documents. Whether or not you agree or disagree with the military arguments, it's important to recognize that most of the people who are affected by anti-personnel landmines today are not soldiers. The estimates are that up to 80% of people affected by anti-personnel landmines are civilians. Now, the statistics are that there are 100 million mines in 70 countries, that 26,000 people a year are being killed or maimed by anti-personnel landmines, 1 every 22 minutes. And I'm going to try something here today. I hope it works. What I'd like to do is I brought some BBs with me, just to demonstrate this. And I just want you to imagine that each of these BBs represents a human being. So, you hear that? That's the person who is killed or maimed while I'm up here speaking with you. What I'll do is this represents the people who were killed or maimed today. What I'm going to do now is just very quickly demonstrate the number of people who will be killed or maimed over the next 3 weeks by anti-personnel landmines. Up to 80% of the people affected are civilians. There's a word for that we use all the time in the medicine. It's called an epidemic. And I think that's how the medical community has really approached this problem, as an epidemic. A lot of people we invited to a seminar with the American Medical Association here in Chicago in June use that term, and it has specific connotations. And what I'd like to do with you now is just take you very quickly through sort of a medical perspective on this issue, talk a little bit about what our organization is doing, and explain, if I can, very briefly, why I think this issue deserves the attention that it's gotten. First of all, with an epidemic, you have to have an agent. In most cases, you're talking about a bacteria or a virus. In this case, we know what the agent is. It's an anti-personnel landmine. I wish that I had one that I could demonstrate to you here today, but they're very small, and we know how these agents are spread. They're cheap, they're available. I've got Jay's speech here, as well as my own. They're cheap, they're available, and they're easy to deploy. A landmine would cost $3 to $5 a piece in most of the countries where we've been working. I just came back from Nicaragua, and I heard a story there I've heard in a number of different countries about a farmer who uses anti-personnel landmines to defend his property and his crops. He places them around his house. Any one of us in this room could take an anti-personnel landmine, go outside, dig a hole, and deploy it. But as easy as they are to put down in the ground, they are as difficult, as dangerous, and as expensive to remove. The estimates are that a $3 mine might cost anywhere from $300 to $1,000 to remove. The estimates are that for every 5,000 mines you remove, you get 1 mine clearer dead and 2 wounded. People will argue about these estimates, but just to give you a concrete example, in the south of France last year, 14 people died removing unexploded ordnance from World War I. That's a first world country 70 years after the war has ended. Can you imagine how long it's going to take Cambodia, with 10 million mines, an average of 142 landmines, anti-personnel landmines per square mile, how long it's going to take them to remove the mines that are in the ground already? If they could, the World Bank estimates that they could boost agricultural output by 60%. The difficulty of removing them is coupled with the fact that they have an indeterminate shelf life. What that means is that 2 weeks ago, there was an Egyptian girl who was killed by an anti-personnel landmine that was laid during World War II. These things stay in the ground and they stay active forever, and they don't discriminate. A landmine can't tell the difference between a child's footfall, the footfall of a mother, or the footfall of a combatant. The other thing you want to know about an epidemic is who's at risk, and we know who's at risk. It's people in the world's poorest countries. Often the countries have a per capita income under $100 or under $50 a year. They're the countries which have the worst emergency services and the least available rehabilitation services. They're predominantly countries that were involved in the Cold War, and the names are all familiar to us from the headlines. Afghanistan, Angola, Mozambique, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Cambodia, Vietnam. These are countries where these low-intensity conflicts were fought, often with the aid of the United States, in which these anti-personnel landmines have been placed years before the conflicts are over, but they're still taking victims. Children are at particular risk. Children tend to be curious, they tend to be inquisitive, they tend to move around a lot. They tend to be victims of anti-personnel landmines. A recent UN report estimated that in Angola alone, there are probably 8,000 children who have been maimed by anti-personnel landmines. Other thing you want to know is, what are the effects of the agent? What are the effects on human beings? We know what the effects of anti-personnel landmines are. They've been well documented. This is important not only to put you off your lunch, and we're just going to talk about it very briefly, but also because at the end of the 18th century, the Russian Tsar convened a peace conference because he'd heard about a type of bullet that goes in very small and leaves a huge gaping wound or blows your head off. And that peace conference, which outlawed dum-dum bullets and exploding bullets, came up with a principle that a weapon should not cause more injury than necessary to take someone out of action. Superfluous injury and unnecessary suffering. There's been a move in the medical community to go after anti-personnel landmines on the grounds that they cause superfluous injury and unnecessary suffering. What that means is that about 50% of people who encounter anti-personnel landmines die immediately. We know this from studies in Cambodia and Afghanistan, and also from some data from World War II, where German POWs who were clearing the Normandy beaches died at a rate of about 56% when they first encountered anti-personnel landmines. The International Committee for the Red Cross, which cares for landmine survivors in their field hospitals, keeps statistics. And we know that the average landmine survivor requires at least 2 transfusions and at least 2 operations. Now that's compared with no transfusions and no operations for gunshot victims. Infection is the rate of infection is 100% with landmine injuries, and the amount of antibiotics is greatly increased over other kinds of war wounds. Very, very briefly, there are 3 patterns of injury. A blast mine is designed to take your leg off, usually below the knee, when you step on it. Blast mine injuries are called pattern 1 injuries. The dirt and debris is driven up into the wound from below. Often, the person's toes will become projectiles, and it's not uncommon to have a person's toes removed from their abdomen. The dust and dirt and debris, which is injected into the wound, causes instantaneous infection. It makes it difficult for surgeons to understand what level they need to amputate at. Surgeons have a phrase called the salami effect, when they have to do multiple operations on a person's leg because there is infection above the level of the amputation due to foreign bodies. And they wind up, a below-the-knee amputation turns into what's called a hip disarticulation, and the leg is lost completely. There is a story which I'll just share with you very briefly about this, which a woman was walking with her grandchild in Vietnam. The grandchild stepped on a landmine. The grandchild was killed. The woman was blinded, and when brought to the operating room, they found a small piece of the grandchild had actually lodged in her eye and caused her blindness. The second pattern of injury is generated by what are called shrapnel mines. These mines are designed to spread hot metal over a certain area called a kill or maim radius. The person who triggers these kinds of mines is almost invariably killed, and surrounding individuals are also injured. These tiny little pieces of metal become the center of infections, and they're very, very difficult to treat, surgeons will tell you. The third pattern of injury is encountered very frequently among children. It's most associated with a type of mine called a butterfly mine, which was used by the Russians in Afghanistan extensively. It's dropped from planes. It's a remote scatterable mine. It has a little bit of, it looks like a little toy, and children pick it up. It has fluid in the wings, which when deformed causes it to explode, and children will lose their hands and their eyesight. It's often common among deminers as well who are handling mines. I recently saw an 8-year-old boy down in Nicaragua who had sustained this type of injury. The long-term effects of anti-personnel mines, permanent disability is what they're designed to inflict, decreased mobility, and this is a big problem in these countries because they don't have access to artificial legs. And when you're using crutches, you lose not only your leg, but also the use of your arms. And what happens to people who are on the margins of societies in very poor economies is they can't find productive employment. They become the focus of enormous resentment amongst their community through no fault of their own. It's the logic of the battlefield. It's tying up not only that person, but his family and those necessary to care for him. And people with disabilities in the developing world have a very tough row to hoe. They are, the word for disability translates as human waste or human garbage in many cultures. So they have a social stigma attached to them. They suffer often from depression and post-traumatic stress syndrome as well. So now that we've gone through that, how do you address the problem? And I think the really extraordinary thing is that this is a story of hope, and a lot's been done on this issue. There are 4 primary ways I'd just like to identify very briefly here today. The first is it's important to stop laying new mines. In 1994, 2 million new mines were laid, 200,000 were removed. We already have enough mines. Mining activity has to be stopped. It's done through a combination of a ban, and it's very important to note President Clinton was the first world leader to call for a ban on these weapons in 1994. And that has to be coupled with export moratoriums. The United States was the first country to have an export moratorium, which was led by Senator Leahy and Congressman Lane Evans from here in Illinois in 1992. The ban has been less quick in coming, although the historic Ottawa process, which I mentioned, just completed last week. 123 countries have signed a ban on the sale, production, transfer, stockpiling, and use of these weapons. It's small and medium-sized countries. and as I mentioned, there are some important exceptions. But as important as the ban is also the new norm. This weapon has been stigmatized. And if you look in 1994, where 2 million mines have been laid, to 1997, this year you will see really no significant mining activity going on anywhere in the world, with the exception of some portions of Angola. And a lot of that has to do with the stigma that's been placed on these weapons by the process which has led to the ban. The second area that's very important is mine surveying. Many of you may have read about ground-penetrating radar, which is being developed here in the United States. It's important because it tells you where the mines are. It also tells you where the mines aren't. And huge tracts of land can be freed up if they're known that there are no mines there. The third area is mine awareness. Imagine gathering wood, collecting water, or simply waking up every morning along the edge of a minefield. A hidden death zone whose hair-trigger sentries never sleep or get hungry or thirsty. That's the reality for people in many parts of the world. And people have to learn to live with that, particularly children, because they tend to be rambunctious, they tend to be explorative, and mines can cause them serious difficulties. The fourth area, and the area which our organization has been predominantly involved in, is in the area of survivor assistance. Mobility aids. I was trained to make artificial legs, and if one of you were to lose a leg today and we brought you over to the Institute, you might pay between $5,000 and $10,000 for an artificial leg. It has to be replaced every 3 to 5 years for an adult and every 6 months for a growing child. We can make legs like this one. This is just a model of a leg, which is made using polypropylene techniques in the developing world for under $100. It's important that people be trained in these technologies, and that these kinds of technologies, which are being developed here at the Northwestern Prosthetics Laboratory, be made available in these countries. Education programs. It's estimated by the World Bank that there are 400 million people with disabilities in the developing world. Less than 2% ever receive any kind of rehabilitation. The population are there, but healthcare workers haven't necessarily been trained to deal with them. So it's very important that we develop educational programs which address the needs of these countries, and that's one of the things that the Rehabilitation Institute, which is really a leader in this country and a world leader in these kinds of programs, trains more doctors like myself than any other institute, has a physical therapy school. That's a role that they can play very effectively and are playing very effectively. Finally, there's the area of resources. It's estimated that currently there's about $35 million being spent globally in the area of artificial legs and mobility aids. Now, I know hospitals that have larger capital campaigns than that. Senator Leahy and our organization have called for the formation of Survivors Trust, which wouldn't cost the U.S. taxpayers anything. It would be set up by Britain, America, and Canada, and money would be given by other countries and by private donors. If we could achieve a level of $100 million endowment, that would generate $10 million additional a year for these kinds of programs. That sounds like not much, but when one realizes that the Leahy War Victims Fund, which is the current funding mechanism, only has $5 million a year, and that's made a tremendous difference in a lot of people's lives. This has a potential to be a very, very important initiative. I just want to wind up with a question I'm often asked: why should we care about this issue? There are so many things going on here in Chicago and around the world. Why is this issue important? And there are usually 3 reasons that I talk about. The first is there's something we can do about it. There has been a process which emerged. There's been a will which has emerged among many countries to ban this weapon. And we have an opportunity to do it, and we should act on it. This is like polio. It's like smallpox. It's something that can be eradicated. We don't need to have any more of these injuries. Technology transfer and education are important components of that. The second is the United States has been involved and continues to be involved in this issue. Over 100,000 U.S. citizens have been killed or maimed by anti-personnel landmines, many of them aid workers, many of them peacekeepers. We have an important we have something important to gain from banning these weapons. 4.4 million dumb mines were exported by the United States from 1969 to 1992. We have been involved in this issue. We should stay involved in it. And the third and final reason is this is an extraordinarily compelling humanitarian issue. These are the world's poorest people. They're the people who are living on the margins of society. Being disabled means they are going to have a very tough life. And I think that's why Princess Diana was drawn to this issue. She had a special feeling for people who suffered. and this is a group that really has. If this were happening here in Chicago, or New York, or Washington, it would be a national crisis, and something would be done about it tomorrow. We shouldn't feel differently just because it's happening in Cambodia, or Angola, or El Salvador. Thank you very much.
Why don't we take a couple questions from the floor? Just raise your hand and state your name, and then go right ahead. You take it. Mike Consul.
Sure, Mike.
Who are the leading manufacturers of landmines, and why don't you go after them?
Well, there has been an effort. The campaign has gone after manufacturers. And not only, there's no manufacturing currently going on in the United States with landmines. However, the international campaign has asked U.S. corporations to make a pledge not to manufacture landmines in the future. And there have been a number, there's a list which I can give you available of the companies which have not agreed to do that. The largest current manufacturer is China North Industries. And I think it's going to be very important to begin to work on the Chinese. It's been difficult because the focus has all been on the United States. And I think the United States has obscured the focus from these other countries. But there have been a number of U.S. manufacturers that have been involved, and some have been very helpful about it, and others haven't.
You also alluded to civilians using it. We think of it as a military thing. They've always been laid down by the military. Is that a problem of civilians actually?
I think the problem is that generally the availability. I think that indicates to you how easy and how cheap these weapons are. So it's really a production problem, that manufacturers are able to turn out these weapons and distribute them to third world countries at a rate that allows civilians there to access them and use them in ways that are outside the military parameters. Pat?
Hundreds of thousands of mines that are currently underground. Is there any program or any method in which those mines can be removed so that future injuries would be eliminated?
Well, that's the area of demining, which I mentioned as an important area. And the United States has just asked for $10 billion, $1 billion a year over the next 10 years to be, channeled into demining. It's not U.S. money, so we'll have to see how that pans out. It's an important area. It's one where the technology right now predominantly consists of a fellow with a prod like this, who is down on his hands and knees, going inch by inch through ground. And that's because of the wide spread of the landmines in different types of terrain, the difficulty finding mechanized ways for removing them, and also the design of the landmines themselves are designed to frustrate easy removal. So there are a number of promising things in the works, but if you ask deminers now, they'll tell you there's really nothing better than a trained deminer. Sure.
I'm Diana Farah. What about our use of landmines in Korea? And supposedly they're the kind of landmines, though, that don't last, as long as the old type did last.
Well, there are two questions, and one is, what about the Korean Peninsula? And the other one is, what about so-called smart mines, mines which deactivate themselves? The first question, the Korean Peninsula, I think the military, many military acknowledge the fact that landmines are really a marginal weapon on the Korean Peninsula. I mean, with the satellite technology that we have, with the smart bombs that we saw at use in the Gulf War, with all of the technological advantages we have, nobody really believes that landmines are all that's standing between us and the Korean Peninsula. We'd be crazy if they were. Landmine fields are easily breached, and there are tunnels going underneath them, and it's not really a compelling argument for maintaining the use of these weapons worldwide. I think it would have been possible to, from a negotiating standpoint, to have gotten a special exemption for Korea if that had been the real issue. I think the second issue, the smart mine issue, is more difficult for the United States. It's one of the difficult areas. Smart mines have a couple of problems associated with them. These are mines that deactivate after a certain period of time. The first is it's a technology which is dominated by us. It's hard if you're looking at prohibiting these weapons to ask someone else to give up their landmines and say, well, we're going to keep the ones that we know how to make just because we have the technology to make them. That's a very difficult sell. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is the rate of effectiveness of the disarming is open to great debate, and deminers will tell you figures of as high as 20% in the Gulf War that didn't deactivate. It's very difficult to know which ones those are, so clearing minefields is not necessarily made any easier. There are different ways that they do deactivate. They either explode or they become unexploded ordnance, and that can create problems for communities where they're laid. So that technology is not really the solution that we hope it would be.
What do you recommend for people who are interested in either making contributions or getting more involved? Is there a website or is there a contact that you would recommend?
Sure. Well, thank you for asking. Yes, we always accept contributions, and we would be delighted. And we have a website, which is www.landmines.org. And there's a registration form on there if you're interested in volunteering or providing any kinds of services. And we would be delighted to hear from you. Take one.
Senator Leahy.
Yes.
I understand he has some legislation. I was wondering if you'd comment on what might happen to that in early '98 or...
It's gotten very broad support on Capitol Hill. I think 2/3 of the Senate has supported it. My understanding on this issue is not as good as it should be, but it's in effect limits Pentagon funding if they continue using these kinds of mines, and it's a controversial area which I can't really comment on as articulately as I should.
Favor of removing the landmines and against the manufacture, and is not for the ban?
That's a good question. You should ask President Clinton. Thank you very much.